A very warm welcome to our fifth webinar in this series titled Farming Under This Labour Government. My name is Laura Geyer. I am a consultant with Laurence Gould Partnership based in our Dunfermline office. This is a hot and topical subject, and I am sure you'll all take something from it with our fantastic three speakers that you'll hear shortly. We are going to pass over to Keith Ledington-Hill. He is the Managing Director in our Market Office, and he will kick off this evening's webinar with Future Farming Resilience Fund Scheme.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome, and our apologies for the hiccup in the start. We've had a bit of a technical issue in the background. This is one of our webinars underneath the Future Farm Resilience Fund Scheme. The scheme actually has been going for 2.5 years, and it's due to end in February 2025, so we're coming towards the end of it. Underneath this scheme, we're delivering four particular topics. One is webinars, which this is one of, and we're focusing on relevant issues, and obviously inheritance tax, etc., is very relevant. We're also doing one-to-one farm visits to review farm businesses and produce a report. And we're also following up with second and third visits for farmers who found those very, very useful in actually setting the agenda for their futures. The last area we're involved in is obviously doing carbon audits, looking at energy efficiency and carbon use on farms. So if you haven't been involved in this scheme before and you want to, please contact us at newmarket@laurencegould.com. Back to you, Laura.
Thanks, Keith. As I previously mentioned, this is our fifth webinar in the series, and we have another one presentation next week. So that's next Tuesday, the 10th at 7 o'clock with Fram Farmers. If you would like to sign up for that, please head over to our website, laurencegould.com, and you'll be able to sign up free of charge there. So a few housekeeping rules for this evening. This webinar is being recorded, and if you would like a recording of it, please email newmarket@laurencegould.com. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end once all our speakers have presented this evening. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the question box, which I believe is found along the left-hand side of your screen. Pop them in there and we will try our very best to get back to you and answer them. There will be 3 polls throughout this evening, 5 polls throughout this evening, and if you could answer them, that would be great. They're just discussion points once everyone has presented at the end. And as I've mentioned, head over to laurencegould.com for any further webinars that you might be interested in. So we're back to Keith now to kick us off properly this evening.
Thank you, Laura. As you all know, this new Labour government was elected on the 5th of July 2024. They've obviously been in power now for 5 months out of a possible 61 months maximum. The next general election will be no later than Wednesday the 15th of August. So what have we learnt in this first period of this government? I think it's pretty clear they're anti-wealth, inheritance tax being one of the major things that's come through so far. They're not very kind to businesses, I don't think, at the moment, with a massive rise in employment costs, and we'll cover that later on in this talk. They also are not very pro-farming. In fact, they're anti-farming with a number of the activities they brought in the budget, whilst they do appear to be pro-environment, and there seems to be a rapid move of support away from BPS to environmental schemes. Now, before we go on to the next slide, we'd like to have the first poll just to gauge people's reaction to the performance of the Labour Party to date. So can we have the first poll, please? Is the first poll up? I'm not sure if the first poll's up or not, actually, but anyway, if not, we'll continue with our next slide, please. Looking at Labour's early performance, look at the general public's view, as you would imagine, it's gone along party lines. Basically, Labour supporters obviously more in favour of what they've done so far. This is before the budget on 30th of October, this YouGov poll. And as you can see, Lib Dems, Conservatives and Reform, as you go further to the right, obviously the less kindest to the performance of the current government. It would be interesting if we do get a poll as to what the people on this webinar feel as to Labour's performance to date. So going on to the next slide. What was the purpose of the budget? From Labour's point of view, was to raise 40 billion of additional tax revenues. I have to say that the budget actually hasn't impacted greatly on currency movements or future Bank of England interest rates, although they're going to be slower to fall in the next year or so for various reasons. The main areas that affected were businesses, including farmers. The four major impacts were the rapid reduction in BPS and the greater focus on environmental support, and I'll come on to that in a minute, increased labour costs, tighter employment rules, and the inheritance tax changes. Next slide, please. So firstly, what didn't change? Because obviously there's been a lot in the press about what did, what didn't. Obviously, you've still got capital allowances on machinery. There's still the £1 million first year allowance. They've still left R&D tax allowances available for companies. Pension contributions have remained unchanged. Dividend rates, again, also unchanged. Personal income tax thresholds, they've left them at the same level. So this is sort of fiscal drag, which I'm sure will be mentioned later on. And corporation tax remains unchanged. So these are the areas that they didn't have a go at to raise extra revenue in the budget. Next slide, please. The basic payment, this was announced about the same time as the budget. It was delinked, as everybody knows, in 2024, and effectively the Labour government's virtually written it off in 2025. For those people who were receiving the high rates above 30,000 in the reference period, you'll be restricted to a maximum of £7,200. For those in the reference period where they were awarded less than 30,000, again, it'd be 24% of whatever the figure was. So eventually they've almost erased the BPS in one fell swoop. The savings in the BPS is being retained in the industry in the DEFRA budget in terms of their support for agriculture. Next slide, please. What they've announced is in the budget that there will be 2.4 billion per annum available for the next 2 years. So where's this going to be targeted? We know from what we've read in the press that 1.8 billion is going to be targeted on environmental schemes, SFIs, country stewardship, etc. There's going to be 200 million for the Weybridge Barker Security Centre. But at the moment, we don't know exactly what's going to be happening with the rest of the schemes, and we probably won't know until the new year. There is a bit of a rollover of 200 million underspend for previous years, the previous government, which we rolled into 25-26. So in that particular 12 months, there'll be 2.6 billion available. Last week, unfortunately, currently capital grant scheme applications were suspended due to the surge in applications caused by budgetary concerns. And it's clear to me with this Labour government that they're going to actually watch the pennies or the millions very, very closely, and where they see the issues with meeting budget limits, they're going to stop schemes quite rapidly, I think. So I think the message is, if you want to go for any of these grant schemes when they become available again, the best thing is to get in early. Next slide, please. The other area which was announced shortly before the budget was the increase in the minimum wage. It went up from 11.44 to 12.21 per hour for full-time workers, 6.73% rise, way above the rate of inflation. And also there was even higher increases for lower paid workers. What has been widely reported in the press, obviously national insurance contributions went up from 13.8 to 15%, and that's from April 25. And the one area which a lot of people haven't picked up so much on is that the employment, the threshold has been reduced from £9,100 to £5,000 per employee. And this applies to larger businesses. And the cost per business here is £615 per employee per year. So overall, the combined increase in size, and I'll show this in the next couple of slides, is a potential increase of 9% in wages. There is, for many farm businesses, a bit of a offset against this in terms of the employee allowance will be increased up to 10,500. So there's a bit of saving there to offset the increase in the rate up to 15%. So if we look at the next slide, we can see if you're looking to employ people on overtime rates, the cost has gone up now to, if you're paying 1.5 overtime rate, to over £21 an hour. So again, the cost of employing staff, particularly for longer hours, is going to become increasingly expensive. And this is a sort of approximately an 8% increase in overtime rates for many farm workers. I think a lot of farm businesses will look at ways of actually trying to reduce the amount of overtime they're paying going forward, because it is getting expensive. And the sort of things they might consider is joint ventures, contract farming arrangements, changing the cropping rotations, making more use of contractors, and for some, investing in machinery, robotics. These are a number of tools that I think people will look at over the next few years because of the rise in labour costs. Next slide, please. So for somebody who was earning £30,000 pre-budget, on the basis that they're going to get the minimum wage rise, there's an extra £2,000 post-budget increase in cost. The combination of the NRC on the extra salary, the increase from 13.8 to 15%, and also the limit reduction, as you can see on the right-hand side, adds up to well over £1,000. So the total employment cost with a 6.73% wage rise is actually a 9.7% increase cost to the business. So as you see, it is going to get quite expensive for people going forward. Next slide, please. Again, different wage rates. The higher the wage rate, the lower the reduction. Basically, the NIC threshold is actually relatively less. Obviously, for higher salary rates, employees, you don't have to pay the minimum wage increase percentage, but again, there will be pressure on within businesses that if the lower rates get the increase, what are you going to give the higher rate players? So it does actually reduce as the employee salaries increase. Next slide, please. So what does this mean to individual businesses? And I've taken 3 examples here, one a cereal farm, one a dairy farm, and one a soft fruit farm, and the impact is slightly different in each case. This is a 650 hectare cereal farm, and I've highlighted the key figures in purple here. BPS obviously going to substantially reduce. It's not such a big issue for the particular soft fruit business I'm talking about here. You can see the labour costs for the cereal farmer is much lower. When you get into the soft fruit business, it's a significantly higher figure per hectare. Looking at the pre-rent surplus, as we all know, cereal farming is under a fair bit of pressure at the moment, and this is before rent and finance charges. So for this particular person, it's £274 a hectare, which is not a very high figure, even with the support of BPS and other income. For the dairy farmer, it's even lower. Milk prices aren't high enough, as we all know, and I'll come on to the soft food business in a minute. So labour as a percentage of the output on the cereal and dairy is 9% and 13%. For a soft food business, it's up at 47%. Broadly speaking, soft food farms, if the labour bill gets over 50%, they're going to struggle to make any money. In fact, there was a large survey by a recognised firm of the soft food industry, and basically across the industry, they had an EBITDA of 4.3%, which basically is break even. Obviously, so there are significant concerns. This performance here is slightly better than average. So what's the impact of the budget? You can see the impact of the budget on the BPS reduction, £81 a hectare for both the cereal and dairy farm in this example. And the labour cost, again, it's not so large on the cereal farm. It's obviously more significant on the dairy farm, but it's absolutely significant on soft food business. When I spoke to this particular guy, I said, how much has your labour bill gone up? And he said it's 300,000. I said, have you included the reduction in the allowance from 9,100 to 5,000? And he said no. And so that added another £200,000. So it's for some intensive horticultural businesses, this is actually very, very significant. And so if you look at the combination of BPS and labour costs, the percent of the pre-rent surplus, it has a large impact on the cereal business, an even bigger impact on the dairy business, and a substantial impact on soft food. So I think there's a lot, whilst these businesses are all under pressure at the moment, what the government have done with the budget is actually increase the pressure on those businesses. Next slide, please. I think if we had the employment firm solicitors on here, I'm sure they could talk for the next hour about the labour laws and what's going to be coming in. But just to outline one or two things here. One is the 2-year qualifying period for protection for unfair dismissal has been removed, so employees get protection rights from day one. There's going to be 28 individual employment reforms ending of 0 hours. The government's stated objective is to keep people in work longer, reduce recruitment costs, etc. I'm not sure they will actually help with recruitment costs. I think more businesses will be more reticent about taking people on as a result of what they're planning to bring in. And they're looking to create a fair work agency. Next slide, please. Carbon taxes on fertilizer. This is basically an environmental tax. It's part of a new carbon border adjustment mechanism, and it will commence on the 1st of January 2027. So it's not in there yet. The estimated cost is apparently between £50 and £75 a tonne. It's not being focused solely on agriculture. It's not an agriculture tax per se, but it's more about a carbon tax. And it's been targeted at fertiliser, hydrogen, aluminium, steel, and intensive industries like that. So again, agriculture has been caught in this. How the government's going to react to imported food that actually uses high levels of fertiliser in other countries, I don't know at this stage. But obviously it's an extra cost on our industry, and obviously makes us less competitive as a result. Next slide, please. Inheritance tax changes, and my colleagues Evelyn will actually go through this in a lot more detail. Labour did state pre-election APR and BPR were going to be left alone. Clearly they haven't adhered to that. Their aim is to target wealthy landowners, and until I did this talk, I hadn't appreciated that 12% of UK land is owned by the 50 top owners. I don't think they're going to reach these people. They weren't going to target small family farms, and CLS estimates 70,000 family farms are expected. And I think it's that this is the area that will be affected by the inheritance tax. The proposed change, according to the government, is expected to raise £500 million per year. So you've got to question, why have they brought it in for so little gain? It seems, for the amount of angst they've created within the industry and within the general public, you do wonder why they've done it. NFU and CLA are making representations to government. Obviously, there was a rally 2 weeks ago when we had another webinar, which was really well attended. And I think the aim is to keep the pressure up. Labour will lose rural votes over introducing the tax. I think they've already lost the rural vote with what they've done so far by making their announcement. Next slide, please. So what can you do to mitigate this tax? Well, first one is to stay alive, obviously, stay fit and healthy and outlive this government, however long they're going to be in for. And that's another whole topic in itself. I think you've got to consider the tax implications for the family and what impact it could have on your own inheritance tax plans, on how they're set up currently for United Financial Affairs. I think you've got to consider what's an acceptable amount of IHT for the beneficiaries to pay on your estate. Some might think I had to pay tax when I inherited, the next generation will have to do the same. Others might say, well, my aim is to get it inheritance tax free to the next generation. Everyone's going to be different. There is still APR available after the budget on agricultural property and business property relief at 50%. So for those outside agriculture looking to invest, they will still look upon it as an element of actually reducing their potential inheritance tax, which has got to be a good thing for those. So I can still see people coming into the industry. Next slide, please. So what can you look at? And a number of things here. I think everyone's going to be different. Obviously, you can look at lifetime gifts, pass over those assets now or in the next 15 months and live for more than 7 years. There's a potential risk here is that you lose control over the assets and business. But again, every family are going to be different. A lot will depend on the relationship between the older and younger generation. But this is one area that people have got to look at earlier in their lives than they perhaps would have historically. Maybe gift land and set up a farm business tenancy to continue trading. Again, you need to consider level of rent and bank security on any current and future debt when these sort of things happen. So it's quite easy to do things, but there might be other things you've got to take into consideration. Others might look to set up company tenancies over land to effectively reduce its value, but again, tenancies may be deemed to have a capital value in the future, shares in the farming company. So again, you've got to be careful on what you set up and make sure it's there for the longer term. One thing you could do is gift any assets with minimal value, i.e. if there are any barns that you think you'd like to develop in the future, for example, again, getting into the next generation sooner rather than later. Again, use hold over relief for capital gains tax on lifetime gifts, something I'm sure Emma and Toby can talk about a bit later. Again, for those who I've spoken to recently, they are looking at life insurance policies to cover the inheritance tax liability, spoke risk, and some of these policies actually haven't been as expensive as I feared. So it is an area that actually people perhaps should be looking at. And the other, which is obviously more contentious within families, is obviously prenuptial agreements for anybody entering into the family and the family business over the next few years. Next slide, please. All of this, the aim is to set out the facts here rather than depress people. And I still think we've got a great industry, and these are more challenges that are being put in our way. But one thing that does concern me is and because farming is quite a lonely business, these two surveys show, even before the Labour government came in and the recent budget, that obviously mental health within the industry is at a low level. And I think it's very important for those on this webinar and generally that if they are struggling or have concerns, that they talk to somebody. And I'll look at the next list. But you can see from this slide, you can see that a lot of the industry are suffering with mental health issues and anxiety and depression, which is very concerning. It is at times a very lonely occupation, but there's no need to go through this alone. There are people out there who can help you. Next slide, please. Communication is vital for the industry. I think farmers, well, men aren't very good at talking, farmers even worse probably. If you have problems, you're not alone. There are organisations out there to help. There's Future Farm Resilience is there for the next couple of months, 3 months, for people to log into if they want any help. Farm Community Network does great things with people who are struggling in the industry, and they're all agricultural benevolence institution likewise. So these organisations are there. If you're feeling struggling or you're not sure what to do, please get in contact with them. Next slide, please. So inheritance tax, I think for many, there's no need to panic, but there is need to plan the transition to the next generation. I think Labour government has brought these conversations forward earlier, and a lot of farms have to transition from one generation to the next. And again, as I said, this is going to happen earlier than they otherwise would have. And it's very important for interpersonal relationships within businesses to enable this transfer, both the young and older generation, to make sure it works well. The 7-year rule remains for the time being. So again, it's there to make the best use of. Please support the NFU CLA in trying to pressurise Labour to change their policy. I think the more pressure that's put on the government, the better. I think they have such a large majority, it's going to be difficult to dent it. But again, unless the support is there to pressurise them, no change will happen. And again, contact your MP, particularly those Labour ones in rural areas. MPs will respond to pressure, especially if they believe their seat in the future is under threat as a result of what central government does. So again, talk to your MP, make them aware of what's happening locally so they can actually, in House of Commons, bring these issues up. Next slide, please. So the budget has increased employment costs and inflationary pressure. I think for families, you need to review your objectives, what you want out of life, what you want from the business. You need to review your farming business, and actually for many, you may have to consider changes. Consider the environmental schemes. They are there. Some people are using them quite widely and to good effect. You need to consider alternative farming income streams. We know for our work on the Future Farm Resilience Scheme has some of the more resilient businesses, those who've actually got a substantial non-farming income, which will help them through the next few months and years. Communicate your thoughts with family advisors. Don't keep it bottled up. That's very, very important. Again, don't overreact and change too quickly. Consider longer term implications of what you're doing. And most importantly, do not structure the business solely for inheritance tax. Don't let the tail wag the dog. A lot of farming businesses are there for the next year, for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. This government's going to be in for the next 5. Think longer term. Don't actually just react solely for what the Labour government has just introduced, but plan your futures accordingly. Thank you. Could we have the next poll, please?
Whilst everyone is taking part in that poll, I would like to thank Keith very much for his presentation there. And if anyone does have any questions, pop them in the question box, or alternatively contact Keith directly through a Laurence Gould Partnership. We are
Laura,
now...
Can I just interrupt, Laura? We had the second poll as well, because there's 2 polls here. I don't know if the second one's happened.
Pop up the third poll, will Labour's budget increase food inflation? If we can pop that one up now, that'd be great. Brilliant, that's the third poll up now, that's great. So whilst that's up, I would like to introduce our next 2 speakers. They are from Evelyn. We have Emma Queen and Toby Talon from Evelyn. Emma is a partner with Evelyn in the Business Tax Services team, and Toby is also a partner with Evelyn in the Private Client Tax Service team. Emma and Toby will be talking about the kind of family and business impacts, and also the political side of things. So I will pass over to Emma and Toby.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to Keith as well. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're all well. So yeah, as Laura mentioned, I'm Emma Queen. I'm a business tax partner at Evelyn Partners. I'm based in our Cambridge office and spend my days advising private and family-owned businesses on all things growth and succession planning, many of those in the rural sector.
And hello, my name is Toby Talon, and I've been at Evelyn Partners, what was formerly Smith & Williamson, if you knew it by that, and if you've been following the press, will again be called S&W from next year. I've been here for over 20 years, and I also work in the entrepreneurial and family business group area. And my first client in tax was a farming client, and it was all about succession, and we're still 20 years on trying to unknot that for them. So I know how hard and how entrepreneurial farming and rural estates are. And since then, I've worked with many other clients, and as a firm, we work with farms and farmers and rural estates all over the UK, and we act for 11 estates in the estates business group. And I would just say, as a precursor to our presentation on the budget, it was a pretty jaw-dropping budget in its build-up, in the anticipation, and then in what unfolded, and the breadth and the depth. And we're not covering the non-dom and the offshore trust changes, but they're on top of everything that we're going to talk to you about now. And so much so that even on the day when Rachel Reeves stood up, she didn't even have time to say that the CGT changes, capital gains tax changes, actually had already taken effect from earlier that day before she stood up. But I'll pass over to Emma, who will take you through what we're going to talk about.
Okay, so some of the points that we're going to take you through today, Keith has covered. We decided to split this presentation into a speed read through the changes in national insurance, motor expenses, capital gains tax, corporation tax, and stamp duty. And we're going to really concentrate and have a couple of case studies on the inheritance tax changes and how that also interacts with the proposed changes to pensions from April 2027. So we will take you through this as quickly as possible because Keith has already mentioned some of these points. So income tax thresholds will be unfrozen, but not yet. That was the headline from Rachel Reeves. And actually, if the personal allowance had increased with inflation, it would now be around £15,000 as opposed to the 12,500 that it is currently. National insurance was a story of two halves. So initially, the increase for employers' national insurance from 13.8% up to 15% was announced in the budget, and we all thought, okay, that's going to be tricky. And then came the real blow, which was actually the reduction in the threshold at which point national insurance is paid, reduced from £9,100 to £5,000. So this really was a double hit. The only saving grace that was added was for small businesses, and the employment allowance increase from 5,000 to 10.5 from April next year. And we'll take you through some of those workings.
Yes, and I would say as an overview on that, the Office of Budgetary Responsibility recognised that of the 25 billion headline that should be generated from those national insurance changes, that was the biggest contribution to the 40 billion whole. Of that 25 billion, about 10 billion will actually not materialise because of behavioural changes, i.e. people will pay people less, they'll employ less people, and there'll be reduced hours for those who stay and work, and an increase in welfare claims. And then another 5 billion of that will actually be handed back to public sector organisations, because otherwise they won't have the funds to pay the extra cost. So of that 25 billion rounded, about 10 will actually end up in the public purse. But this slide here puts a bit of flesh on the bones for that. Don't worry about all the numbers there. There are three things that are going on. The first thing is on the left, we've got the 15% rate rather than the 13.8% rate. The second thing is the reduction in that threshold. So employers start paying national insurance contributions at £5,000 rather than 9,100. And the third thing is that with the allowance has gone up for everyone from 5 to 10,500. So what does that mean? Well, as you can see on the left, what that means is you've got, if you've got a small number of people who work for you, then you get a cost benefit from that way. If you've got, and I can't see how many people it is because on my screen, but if you've got 7 workers, then you're about break even. And then after that, the costs keep mounting and mounting and mounting, and it gets progressively more expensive. So totally agree with Keith's remarks. This is not a budget that helps growth and jobs. Over to you, Emma.
Okay, so we'll cover this one very quickly. So the rules for double cab pickups were changed actually by the Conservative government in February 2024, and due to the backlash that was received, that was subsequently reversed. But Rachel Reeves has decided to bring this in now, and it changes the definition for capital allowances purposes, which gives you your business relief, and also for benefit in kind purposes. No changes to VAT at the moment. In terms of tax planning and what can be done here, really it's making sure you're buying the right truck. Or the alternative is leaving the truck on site potentially. But again, you've got to think about commercial and practical implications here as well as the tax. Okay. So
the next slide is about capital gains tax. So that was hitting all the headlines. That was what was getting most of the press and way in advance, ever since Rachel Reeves stood up at the end of July and said there's going to be a budget at the end of October. That was what was really capturing the imagination. But what actually happened in the end? Well, we didn't see sky-high rates coming in, and in fact what we saw was the basic rate of capital gains tax increased from 10% to 18%, so that's quite a sharp hike of 80% increase. But the main rate was at 20% and went up to, in quotes, only 24%. that is effectively only a 20% increase, and a lot lower than we had, and it was being suggested might happen. That 24% rate is the same rate that people pay for residential properties. If you thought of the 28% rate, that used to be 28%, but that was reduced earlier in the year. So, no, effectively that's brought into line with residential property rates. We also saw what's called the business asset disposal relief rate, what used to be called entrepreneurs relief rate. So this is the capital gains tax reduced rate of 10% that applies if you have a business and it qualifies on a sale. There was rumours that might be abolished entirely. Bad luck, that will be scrapped. But hey, good news, that wasn't scrapped and that remains in place. Still got the 1 million lifetime limit, although progressively, as you can see on the slide, that 10% rate will be increased to 18%. So it's brought in line with that increase of the basic rate. The fifth point is what a fiscal drag. So what I mean by that is what we're seeing is a combination of factors, like with income tax, like with the nil rate ban for inheritance tax. What we're seeing is no allowance for the fact that inflation has been in place for a long time and been quite high in the last few years. So we haven't had any indexation allowance since 1998 when it was frozen, and 2008 when it was withdrawn for individuals. We haven't had a rebasing of capital assets since 1982. And we still have the annual exemption allowance every year, which is £3,000 for an individual or £1,500 for a trust. So that brings us to sort of the last point on this slide, which is there are sort of two behavioural impacts that I think that are interesting to draw out from here. One of which is that what that could do for investor. Oh, Emma, you're back. Hello. You do what's the impact then for investors' risk appetite?
Apologies. I think we've concluded that the Workcast platform does not like me at all. Behavioural changes from the changes in capital gains tax. I think there was a lot of talk before the budget about this being a budget for business and a budget for growth. What has struck me as really bizarre is the alignment in rates for an individual who's built a business in whatever industry that might be, that employs people, that is additive to the economy. Somebody selling that business will pay now the same rate of capital gains tax as a landlord who is selling a second property, which to me is not an incentive for entrepreneurship. It doesn't align with the narrative of this being a budget for growth. So I think, it's going to be interesting, the behaviours that will come out of this, Toby.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The other thing that struck me was that the Treasury behaviour was interesting here, and then what impact they have had from what they've seen from their colleagues at HMRC. Because in June 2024, HMRC crunched the numbers. They crunched numbers on loads of things. Income tax, inheritance tax, etc. But they did crunch numbers also on capital gains tax. And their conclusion was, well, if you increase the rate of capital gains tax by 1%, that's probably going to be most bang for your buck in terms of raising revenue. If you increase capital gains tax to 5%, you will not raise a single penny extra. So that's why I wasn't surprised when they went for the highest rate they could get, which didn't end up with actually not raising any additional revenue. So what I'm hopeful here, now I might call me an optimist, but what I'm hopeful here is that does suggest that they are listening and thinking about, when they've taken the time to actually commission and look at and consider what the fiscal impact will be of these changes, they do then change their mind from what was originally proposed. So bear that in mind before we get on to the later section on inheritance tax. Back to you, Emma.
I am attempting to move the slide forward.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Can we see the corporation tax one?
Yes, I can see the corporation tax one.
So the big news for corporation tax is that there was a roadmap published. Now, the roadmap didn't make for particularly interesting reading unless, like us, your tax advisors. It confirmed a lot of the current state of play, but we were welcoming of the roadmap, because in a budget with lots of ups and downs, actually the roadmap was a commitment to some consistency, and we know that consistency from a policy perspective is positive for business because it enables decision making, investment decisions, and all those good things. So that was very much welcomed. So the headline corporation tax rate will remain the same for the entire Parliament, and the full expensing relief and annual investment allowance that is already available for purchases of capital equipment such as plant and machinery. There were directors' loans and directors withdrawing cash from the business as a loan. It's targeted anti-avoidance rules, really to prevent owners of businesses with more than one company from doing a bit of jiggery pokery and moving those loan balances around to try and get round the tax rules. So a piece of targeted anti-avoidance, not a fundamental change in the legislation. Just trying to move it on again, Toby, but it's not moving for me.
Let me try. Please. There we go. Shall I take over? I'll take over moving the slides. Next one's SDLT.
SDLT, the rates have gone up for second homeowners. The payments are still within the same time frame, but second homeowners now will pay a surplus of 5%, whereas previously the surplus was 3%. Now, it would appear they have done the reasonable thing for those property purchases that had exchanged but not yet completed. So where contracts have been exchanged before the 31st of October 2024, those can still complete under the old SDLT rules at the 3% surcharge instead of the 5% surcharge, as long as there isn't a variation to the contract. So the legal position must be as was agreed pre 31st of October, and they haven't put a deadline on that. So as far as we're aware, there doesn't seem to be a deadline for having to complete as long as you've exchanged before the 31st of October 2024. That was that on that one, Toby.
Right, so here's the main event then, and we're going to talk about what the impact is on inheritance tax changes to APR and BPR and to pensions. And Emma, I don't know if you could change your performance settings, so then it might smooth out some of the unevenness on your end. You might have lost Emma.
I know I am here. I've just turned my video off.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I've moved over the slide. It's over to you, Emma. So tell us, what is happening with APR and BPR?
APR and BPR are inheritance tax reliefs that are designed for certain businesses were initially designed for certain businesses to be able to pass down to the next generation without a very burdensome inheritance tax charge attached to it. So historically, if I have owned agricultural property or farming business, or actually most other private businesses, I would have been able to hand those down to my children without my children having to pay an inheritance tax charge. Now, one of the nasty surprises from the budget was that actually that relief is being capped at £1 million for both APR and BPR. And that £1 million is a combined level of relief. So that's a really, really significant significant change for a lot of our clients, and clearly has a big impact on succession planning. There are still some uncertainties within the announcements. So, for example, for those businesses that already operate within a trust structure, assets held within trusts have an IHT regime all of their own, and there's a 10-year charge to inheritance tax within a trust. We're not clear at the moment from the legislation whether that 10-year charge is going to be at 3% or 6%, as it is at the moment. So we still have a lot of questions when it comes down to trusts. There will be a consultation on trusts early in 2025, when we will, to be honest, be much better equipped to support clients in making decisions around trust planning once that's come out. So I think message here, everybody on this call will be aware of these headlines. We are consulting. We are supporting your industry from a lobbying perspective, and we are doing everything we can to support our clients through this. I'm going to hand over to Toby now, who will be able to take you through a bit more detail into, okay, Emma's explained what's changing. What does that mean for me? What do I need to be thinking about?
Thank you, Emma. Yes, exactly, and it's a similar overview as you heard from Keith, which is there are actually some planning opportunities, but there are some potential bear traps. But the overall message is it's very similar to what Keith said earlier. Don't panic, and there is some time to plan. These rules don't take effect until April 2026. But as Emma said, so that's the change. What does that mean? So I think the kind of order of business for all our clients and anyone on this call who's affected is step one, just think about what does that change mean for you. So what under the do nothing, if you did nothing, what would be the impact? And Keith mentioned a couple of things. So one of them was you can use insurance, you can get insurance to cover the cost of that inheritance tax liability. And the other is you can, in many circumstances, pay that over 10 annual installments, 10% per year, with no interest being due. Although if you're late paying anything, then the interest will be at 4% above base, which is pretty eye-watering. So that's the first thing. What's the do nothing option? Second thing is review trust. So if anyone on this call has got their assets held within a trust, then we need to understand more what's in this consultation. What does it mean? There are lots of unanswered questions there. Does that mean I should put more assets in? Does that mean I should take more assets out? What is the tax charge effective rate on those assets that are in trusts? Is it going to be effectively a 6% rate, or will they get the 50% discount where they apply as well? And so it's effectively a 3% rate. It's not quite how it works, but effectively, is that what's going to happen? Don't know, can't tell you right now. So I wouldn't be in a rush to change things in or out of trust at this stage. That's why Emma made the point that we really need to understand more what's in that paper. And Emma was a bit more bullish than I was that we might be see what how hopeful we are as to what clarity we'll see within that. But let's at least see what's in that paper. Then the third point is married couples allowance. So this is what you have seen in the press. We have all seen in the press doing the rounds a lot, and the Labour front bench have been making a lot of hay about this to say, don't worry, most people will find an easy way around this. Well, maybe that's the case, maybe not, and we've got an example which we'll run through for you on this call. But it is true to say that married couples can effectively have a £2 million APR and BPR combined allowance between them. It's not transferable though. It is a use it or lose it, so you do need to make use of it. Then the fourth thing is consider lifetime giving. And again, Keith talked about that. So the good news was there was no other changes to those rules. So if you're aware of those rules, if you make a gift of something and you survive that gift by 7 years, then the PET rules, the potentially exempt transfer rules, still apply as they did as you knew them before. And there's still the ability, if you make a gift of an asset that qualifies as a business asset, you can get holdover relief, so there'd be no capital gains tax. So there is an ability to do that. You can make a gift and survive the gift, and then it can be completely tax neutral. Although that depends on being able to afford to do that, being able to survive that gift, and also in most of the situations, which is the biggest tricky headache, to whom to make that gift. And again, we'll come on to that a bit later. And the final point is beware of gifts with reservation of benefit. If you haven't heard that phrase before, it's a technical sort of tax phrase that comes from legislation, and that is one of the big bear traps. So if you make a gift, you have to not reserve a benefit in the technical parlance. You have to make that gift and not enjoy any benefits of it thereafter, and that can be trickier than it sounds, especially where you've got a whole farming business if you're trying to give away bits of it. So
thank you Toby. So the bit that I think really can you hear me?
I can, yeah, we can hear you.
The bit that really bothers me from a tax policy perspective here is that all of the decision making, particularly when it comes to farming businesses, historically has, with APR in place, those decisions have been able to be based on family circumstances, income requirements, the performance of the farm, all these kind of good commercial factors. And now, actually, the timing of that succession plan and the structure of that succession plan is going to be inevitably heavily influenced by tax, which doesn't feel like the right way round from a decision-making perspective. So, Toby, I know you have a view or two on the tax policy piece here. We have been lobbying. We've seen lots of views in the media about this being bad politics, bad economics. What are your thoughts as to the permanence of this?
Well, thank you for inviting me to get on my soapbox. I'll be careful with what I say, but I do feel very strongly on this subject, and I have been posting lots on LinkedIn and in the media as well. And I think this is rushed. I think this is ill-considered. I think this is ill-advised. I think it's misguided. And those are my polite ways to reference how I think this is being brought in. How permanent that is, well, I think it's still early days. And what we're seeing is there's a huge amount of concern that is within the farming industry in the rural economy, and they have done a fantastic job of bringing people together, and I think the demonstrations on the 19th of November are a good example of that, but that's only the beginning of that. We have heard that sort of behind closed doors there have been some conversations with Keir Starmer from people who would represent the farming community, and he was signalling that perhaps he is in a bit more listening mode in private than he is suggesting in public. We're also seeing that there are very high-profile public commentators, such as Dan Needle, who is a very erudite tax lawyer turned tax commentator, who came out very quickly after the budget to say how he thought it was a jolly good idea and how it wouldn't affect many farms and this was all being overblown. He's actually reversed that position 3 weeks later to say, actually, I think this is a bit too much and too far. And he's suggesting a number of different ideas, but his main one was to increase that 1 million allowance up to 20 million. So my view is, I think this is still early days. And I'm not sure to what extent there will be changes, but there's certainly going to be an increase in pressure, and that's only going to build. And so that adds to the point that Keith made, which is take the time to plan for this, don't rush it, and to see what comes out of the wash. So this is an example then of what the impact is pre and post budget for someone who doesn't take any planning. So your point, Emma, about, hang on, what's the impact for someone who didn't know and wasn't letting the tax tail wag the dog. Now, there's a lot of numbers on this page. I'm not going to go through all the numbers. Suffice to say that on the left-hand side is pre-budget, so what the impact would be before. On the right-hand side is post-budget, what would be the impact after these changes. And on the left-hand side, you would have got that hypothetical client, which happens to be a real one of ours, would have got a lot more agricultural property relief and a lot more business property relief. And those are in the boxes, the red boxes. They would have got over 3 million quid and over 350,000 respectively. Whereas on the right is what the impact will have on this individual there, this couple, after the budget. And they will have a lower amount of agricultural property relief and a lower amount of business property relief. And the net result is an increase in the inheritance tax due from 228 to 608, so almost £400,000 more of inheritance tax. And Emma is now going to take you through this exact same scenario and think about what one of the main planning tools that could be used is, what could you do if you made use of that couple's allowances each. Emma, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Toby. So again, this is a complicated looking slide, and there are lots of numbers on there, but the key takeaway is that there is still an increase by doing something. So what we've suggested here is that if you're looking at a married couple situation, instead of what the surviving spouse inheriting everything, actually the spouse that's passed away would pass their assets down a generation, whilst the surviving spouse retained their 50% in this scenario. And you can see here that the impact is twofold. So there is significantly less agricultural property relief and business property relief available, but also there is a restriction because the estate, I'm just looking at this now, sorry, because where estates are over £2 million, there can also be a restriction on the availability of the residence nil rate band. We'll come on to show how that's impacted by the pension changes as well. But there are a lot of contributing factors here. But you can see, by simply making this relatively straightforward from a tax planning perspective change, there is a considerable inheritance tax saving.
That's right, over 200,000 saving there. So and that the importance of that residence nil rate band is, you may have seen in the press, it's been talked about there being a £3 million allowance, and that's because it's the £2 million because of 1 million each for the APR and BPR for a married couple, and also then the nil rate band of 350,000 each, and also then of this residence nil rate band 175,000 each. Well, that's not in all cases, and this example shows how that can be restricted and the impact of that. So that's where I think, again, the politicians particularly are getting their numbers in a bit mixed up. And that's what this slide is designed to demonstrate. So that's through the changes for the APR and BPR rules. Next is the change for the pension rules. So here, there was this was another big announcement that was well trailed, but that was in the was announced on the budget day. Will it take effect not from April 2026, but from April 2027? And the big change there was that pension schemes will fall into the inheritance tax net on death, and that was a big change from the position we were before. And I mean, my sort of takeaway from that is that it wasn't that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, a pension wasn't something that you built a pot of assets up and then you passed on. A pension was a pot that you built up, which then produced an income for you to enjoy during your retirement. And that was the same whether it was a defined benefit scheme, which is paid by your employer at their risk, or defined contribution or money purchase scheme that you would put in your own pot, you had to then buy an annuity when you came to retire, and you only had an income stream. Various pension freedoms rules that came in meant that that pot didn't have to be used in a defined contribution scenario, did not have to be used to buy an annuity, and actually you could just draw down on those assets, and if you didn't use them, you could pass them on. And in order to take a bit of tax from that, there was the lifetime allowance, and at age 75 or potentially earlier, there was a tax charge that would hit that, a sort of capital tax charge. In 2023, Jeremy Hunt removed that. That was the Conservatives who removed that. And Labour said the very next day, well, we're going to bring that straight back in then. But in true pantomime season, oh no, they didn't. And instead, I think they found it politically difficult in order to do that. And so they, partly because that would affect civil servants, GPs and head teachers. And so they haven't reinstated that. Instead, they just said, okay, fine, all pensions, all defined contribution pensions and certain bits from defined benefit pensions will fall into the inheritance tax net. So that's the key thing from this slide, and that's a big change. The other points on there are various other things to consider in terms of how that apply to other types of pensions, including QNUPs and so on, which I won't go into. The point about the calculator is that HMRC will provide a new calculator, and that will need to be worked in combination with the pension scheme administrator. What that means is it's going to be flipping complicated. It's going to be very time pressured in a scenario where you've had a death and you have to then try and do all the probate stuff, get all the information together, and you've got a 6-month deadline to try and contact the various pension scheme people in order to make the various claims, and use an HMRC calculator in order to calculate what's due, which may or may not be correct. So suffice to say, we have some serious doubts as to whether this will be effective or not in terms of how that will operate.
This one I think we'll just whiz through super quickly. So this is just a very quick demonstration that the inclusion of the pension pot in somebody's estate is not necessarily a straightforward multiple effect of that the increase in the size of the death estate by including the pension. Actually, it can have knock-on impacts, and you can see here pre-budget on the left, the pension pot being excluded means that the taxable estate is £1 million, and the proportionate rate of inheritance tax due is 16%. Post-budget, excluding the pension pot, actually the taxable estate increases to 2.175 million, and that has the effect of saying, okay, you're no longer eligible for the residence nil rate band. So it's not just the change in the pension and the rate, it actually has a knock-on impact on some other allowances and the rate at which those are received. So in that situation, that takes it up to 35% marginal rate effectively. So significantly less cash available for the beneficiary. I think the interesting part to this is on the next slide, Toby, and this is an example that we see with lots of families, because it's very difficult to pass a farm on to multiple children. And actually, in recent years, what we've seen is a lot of families who will decide that the farm will be left to one of their dependents, and actually to compensate the other one for that, they will be left with the pension pot. Now, while we had 100% APR and the pension pots were falling outside of the estate for inheritance tax purposes, this was a relatively straightforward calculation. The position that we're in now is for those families who have planned for one dependent to receive the farm and the other to receive the pension pot, is that the actual value post inheritance tax of those assets has changed. And so there's a question now over rethinking equalisation of that inheritance. Now, what that could potentially mean is that there might be an interest in one pot. So, for example,
Oh, I think we've lost Emma. Emma might come back in, but yes, it's complicated, and instead of before being able to pass pension inheritance tax free and the estate and the farm inheritance tax free, actually now one might have some relief, another no relief, and there might be a pot in the middle, say the residential properties or other assets that don't that are sort of part of the farm to support the farm but aren't actually farming, and maybe that needs to be the pot that needs to be divided up to equalize the impact of the a family member, a child perhaps getting an asset that now is taxed. And that's the point that we're trying to make here. And we see this as a very common scenario with children from a farming family, the tricky decision of who to pass on the farm to, when to do it, and how to make that equal and fair across the other children. And that's the point of this slide. I'm going to stop sharing now because that's the end of the Evelyn Partners slides.
Thank you very much, Toby and Emma, for great, absolutely amazing, and very, very informative. Keith, I think you would maybe like to join back in now and perhaps pop up the fourth poll of this evening. And if we could just have a few moments for the fourth poll. And Keith, you might want to just unmute yourself there. And then if we could possibly pop up the final poll of this evening, the fifth poll, and we will then discuss the results. And whilst we're waiting on the results coming in, I'll just like to say that Laurence Gould have a webinar next Tuesday evening, the 10th at 7 o'clock. And if you are interested in succession planning, then please contact the Newmarket office on the email address below, and or alternatively you could head along to our website laurencegould.com and sign up there. I think Keith is maybe struggling. Can you hear us, Keith? Yep, it's just, your mute button is maybe still on.
Laura, have you muted Keith? That's very naughty. We want more Keith.
I don't think I have the power to do that. So I think what we'll do is we'll discuss the results from the first poll. Oh, you're back.
Yes, sorry, I had a technical issue there, as you can imagine. The first poll, as we would expect, very few people think that we're in a better state as a result of the budget and of the Labour Party being in power. A small percentage think that it's about the same. An awful lot think we're in a much worse state, and quite a few don't know at this stage. So that's why I would have expected on this poll with this particular audience that very unhappy with the Labour Party performance to date. The second poll, I can't get the results up.
So the answers are reduce wages 13%, reduce staff 16%, employ self-employed staff 13%, employ contractors 20%, and no action 38%.
Do you want to do the other two polls as well, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. So poll number 3, will Labour's budget increase food inflation? So yes is a staggering 82%, no 5%, and don't know 12%. And then our final two, poll number 4, which was the first one you just completed. Yes was 71%, no 10%, and don't know 19%. And then the last poll of this evening, which was, have you or are you planning to meet your accountant and or solicitor regarding future IHT planning? So 50% said yes, accountant, 30% was yes, solicitor, 3% to no accountant, 3% to no solicitor, and 13% to not sure. So yeah, I think a lot of accountants could be quite busy.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I think we'll just go on to questions because we've got quite a few questions in the attendees question box. First one, I think most of them are going to be for you, Toby, or if Emma's on the call. Is there anything farmers should be doing between now and April 25?
I think it's what you said. Forget the tax. Think about what you want. What's important to you? Where are you now? Where you want to get to? Think about those things that are important to you. We have time before April 2026. I wouldn't be rushing to take action in advance of that. So think about what's important to you and perhaps model what the impact of these changes is, but don't be in a rush to necessarily make changes.
Okay, we've got another one. If one of a married couple has the assets, i.e. land, and the other has capital, can they make use of the maximum relief available underneath the new rules? So I guess if one's got land, the other one's got all the
machinery.
BPR. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, it's possible that you can make use of each in that scenario.
This is another question. Will the valuations for inheritance tax be open market value?
Oh, great question. The valuers are going to have this is not meant to be a pun, but a field day. It's going to be absolute carnage because the way it works currently, if the assets qualify for 100% relief, then there's no need to go to the Shares and Assets Valuation Division at HMRC and get that tested. And so you don't have to go nearly as far as you perhaps might need to. Whereas in a scenario where you've got reduced relief or no relief, the valuations matter like stink, and you absolutely need to get that right. There are very prescribed valuations that are required for these types of scenarios. Agricultural value is required for agricultural property relief, not open market value. There's very prescribed rules. If your business is in a company and there are shares, there are more rules to get your head around in terms of what that rule looks like, in terms of minority discounts. If there's a potential special purchaser, that could have an impact as well. Absolutely, the valuation is going to be key to this, and that may also give rise to some opportunities in how you think about holding assets across different family members. Emma, is there anything more you want to say on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think valuation is going to be one of the hardest aspects, and we all know that valuations are an art rather than a science, although we obviously do have to apply certain scientific methodology to them, and that makes it challenging, doesn't it, to plan for, because it means that there's less certainty, and it's also something that inevitably will move and change.
And I think the Central Association for Agricultural Valuers, the CAAV, is a really good repository of advice and thinking on that front. So check them out.
And another question in relation to it, in terms of debt, if you've got let's say an AMC mortgage against a plot of land, or you have a HP agreement against a piece of machinery, are these taken into consideration with inheritance tax?
Another great question. Mm-hmm. Yes, they are, but there is a restriction on how effective that is if it's against a qualifying asset. And those were rules that were introduced, stretch my brain now, about just less than 10 years ago. So yes, you get relief, but for the debt. But if it's against something that qualifies for agricultural property or BPR, then there could be a restriction on how effective that is. And that can be really important where you've got debt against a rural estate, which has a combination of assets that do and don't qualify for relief. So that is a really key point to try and unpick.
Thank you. A question here: can we avoid inheritance tax by putting our land into a trust? No.
Good question. And this has been something the media have picked up on a lot. All these rich landowners, they're putting their assets into trust and they're disappearing from the inheritance tax net. That's not actually true. Trusts have their own inheritance tax regime. They have like a mini regime on the side, but putting assets into trust does not mean that those assets will never be subject to inheritance tax. It just means that the rules under which inheritance tax will be applied are slightly different. The decision to put assets into a trust shouldn't be driven by the requirement to save inheritance tax. That it may have a slight impact in the long run, but also it may not. The reason you would use a trust is largely to plan for succession in a controlled manner. So it allows the ability for first generation to pass assets to the second generation to benefit from, but actually still retain some control. The other reason you'd use a trust is for asset protection purposes, and for, whilst nobody wishes that their children's marriages will end badly, the reality is that there is a risk there, and so to protect assets for the bloodline, trusts can also be a very effective tool. So don't believe all you read. Trusts they're a very powerful tool in some cases, but inheritance tax would not be the number one reason for using one.
Thank you, Emma.
And I would just add to that any trust that's set up now won't get the £1 million relief as well. So it's only trusts that were in existence prior to 30th of October, and we're waiting for that consultation paper. So I can't tell you what the tax rules will be if you do put it in. You might have a nasty tax charge on the way in as well. So hold fire.
Thank you. Another good question here. They're all good questions, I have to say. We could be going all night, I think, at this rate. But anyway, if there's a farm business partnership set up with the oldest partner owning all of the land, would he be deemed to have a retained benefit if he gifted the land to a younger partner already in the business?
Let's say potentially yes, and get some advice. Complicated.
Yes, I can imagine. Are the values buildings such as machinery, sheds and cattle housing and stocks and materials eligible for BPR? And is this additional to APR?
So yes, if they're assets used within the business, the £1 million limit is the total for APR and BPR assets.
And the sort of lead case on that is Farmer in 1999, which was a business property relief case, but the clue's in the name. It was about a farmer. It's about over 400 acres, and it was exactly that point. Assets that are used within that farming business, where it's wholly or mainly for the benefit of the business, over 50% can qualify for relief. So yes, is the short answer. Again, detailed, but yes, is the short answer.
This is probably a bit more involved, but a small farmer run as a husband and wife partnership with 150 acres and let farm buildings, approximately value £2 million, with the farmhouse in the centre of the land worth another £1 million for argument's sake. How will these assets be regarded in the inheritance tax calculations under the proposed tax changes? So basically, land and buildings 2 million, farmhouse 1 million.
And then agricultural land as well. So
there's a partnership.
Yeah, there's a mixture. So there's a couple of points there. One is that farmer case wholly or mainly. So to what extent is that let property business part of that whole business? And second is the tax case called Balfour, which was about are you able to compartmentalize businesses by using a partnership? So you have this bit over here, which is the farming business, and this bit over here, which is the let property business. And if you've done that, then potentially this bit over here can't qualify for relief. If it's not that scenario and they're all in one pot, then potentially you're within farmer and you could potentially get relief on the whole shooting match. Subject to other caveats and detail.
Okay, thank you. If farmers have entered into credits for biodiversity net gain or carbon capture, are they counted as financial assets for the purposes of inheritance tax?
This is a question that we are looking at the moment. So BNG credits are a complicated area, and there has been absolutely no tax guidance on the treatment of a BNG credit. Having done a little bit of work with Bidwells and a couple of clients in this area, the accounting, the only position that we can adopt at the moment is that the accounting will dictate the tax treatment. Now, the accounting treatment, I think, will depend, and we are seeking expert advice, and we are also sitting on HMRC's BNG panel at the moment, trying to get some certainty over this. But this is a very grey area at the moment. I've got some clients who are looking to use companies. Other clients who are looking to use a partnership structure, and others that maybe a mixture of the two might work best for them. But the tax treatment, the whole industry is very much in the dark at the moment, I'm afraid, on BNG, but we are working on it.
This is another follow-on question from that, Emma. And applies to quite a lot of farms at the moment, particularly those with solar parks on the land. What about farm diversifications, which many farms have developed to make ends meet? Once reliefs have been swallowed up by the farm, these will be fully taxed, i.e. renewable energy, which are capital intensive, or basically buildings let out for rent.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think those will be within the scope.
And what rate would they be paid tax at? Inheritance tax? Would it be 40% or would it be 20%?
I think it depends if they qualify for APR or BPR, or if they. I can't answer the question on.
But there'll definitely be scenarios where they're taxed at the full whack.
Full 40, definitely. There might be some examples where.
I think the presumption would probably be 40%, unless you've gone some in order to make it a business. Or
sounds as there's going to be a trial case on this at some stage down the line, I suspect.
Yeah.
What help can FCN RABI give to farmers under present circumstances? I think one of the biggest benefits they can give is actually basically get in contact. You can have somebody to talk to and talk through these problems. You might not necessarily get the answer, but I think a lot of these situations, something shared is something halved, and I think that's quite important. And some of these people in FCN and RABI will have contacts. I know people like Toby or whatever, and Emma or myself, and get them involved with your businesses. So please do speak to people, because I think this is very important. I can see this particular one. How would my farm be valued? It is currently my parents'. However, I have worked on it for the past 30 years and helped it to become what it is today, and have invested my own money into it in forms of buildings and concrete. Would this be taken into account when my parents' estate is valued? I can see this being quite a common question.
So the estate has been added to by the next generation.
Yes.
But owned by the
parents.
And it might not necessarily be reflected in the accounts.
No, that's what I was just about to say. Unless that person introduced funds for those developments to the parents' business by making some sort of a loan, which I think practically is probably quite unlikely, then yeah, those assets will all form part of the parents' estate.
So in effect, one of the things I think as a planning exercise that a lot of farming partnerships need to do, I imagine, is that they need to look at their capital accounts within the farming partnership as to how that's split at the moment and how that should be managed over the next few years. Is that something you would be recommending people to do?
Absolutely. So you said exactly right. So I'm not sure the question was about a farming partnership, but I agree, if there is a farming partnership, that will be a critical way, and it will be really important to establish how those capital values are split between different members. And there may also be potential to make to set one up or to make gifts to individuals as well. So again, subject to those gift reservation rules.
This is again going to be a common one, I think. I have 8 holiday cottages and 3 glamping lodges on the farm. How will this affect me?
So shall I take this one, Emma? There's furnished holiday lets. My goodness, they've been through the mill. So they qualify for capital gains tax and income tax benefits under the furnished holiday regime. It's a real pantomime season because they were going to, under Jeremy Hunt, they were going to get in his last budget in spring earlier this year, they were going to be removed from that regime with anti-forestalling. Then the government fell, and that legislation never saw the light of day. So actually, they are still within that regime for capital gains tax and income tax. So there is still a window between now and 5th of April 2025 to either gift those without, and you could possibly hold over the gain, or to sell them and get potentially get a 10% business asset disposal relief rate. But in terms of inheritance tax, all the tax cases that I've seen so far, the taxpayers lost. They have not passed the bar for it to be an inheritance tax qualifying, BPR qualifying trade, and therefore they would not qualify for relief for inheritance tax.
Okay, if we another good question here, if we transferred or gifted assets ahead of the budget and the 7-year clock has started, will this be affected by the April 26 changes, or are we safe? I think I'm guessing if they pass them on now, are they subject to a 40% capital inheritance tax, which is going to be reduced over the next 7 years, or does it become 20% after April 26?
There is anti-forestalling that's been brought in on the 30th of October, and that was one of the examples. It was if you made a gift after that date, and then that became a failed pet. But I think the question was if a gift had been made before the budget, wasn't it?
Yes.
So my expectation, understanding, subject to being firmed up on this, is that no, that would be effective, and it should be under the old rules.
Okay. Yes, I think we have so many more questions. I think I'm trying to find suggestion for unmarried aunt stroke uncle leaving to nephew or niece. Low allowances, small working farm valued at over £1 million. Question is, why does her grandchildren have to pay so much more tax because they didn't marry or have children, which wasn't by choice?
I'm full of sympathy. I agree the question. I understand where it's coming from. That's the effect of those rules. There are various tax rules which look at cohabiting partners that aren't married. This is not one of them, and so there wouldn't be those reliefs.
It's a good question. Again, I'm going to be quite common. If my mother gifts the farm to me, can she benefit by continuing to live in the farmhouse and also taking some income from the farm business?
Yeah, so only if she pays a market rate of rent for the farmhouse will it fall completely outside of the estate. So Toby mentioned earlier these rules called gift with reservation of benefit, which is exactly exactly what your example just pointed to. So giving something away, but continuing to actually practically benefit from it. If on the farmhouse a market value rent was paid by the mother to the son or daughter, then that would prevent those gift with reservation of benefit rules kicking in. In terms of the farm income, again, I think you would need to evidence that the mother was effectively an employee, and was earning that income from the farm partnership.
From their labour rather than any past ownership entitlement.
Another question: can you reverse a gift? Is there a cooling down period?
Golden question.
A properly effective gift, no. An improperly ineffective gift, maybe. It's the simple answer, I would say. Usually a gift is a gift is a gift. So no is the usual answer.
Okay. Would there be stamp duty to pay on a gift of land with capital gains tax holdover?
Great question. Emma, you did the stamp duty bit. You take this one.
It depends. It depends on the consideration. So stamp duty land tax is only due on actual consideration. So as long as there were no mortgages or anything attached and it was an outright gift, then there shouldn't be any SDLT, is my understanding.
Okay, thank you. And I think we better wrap up with the last question here. How do you anticipate this will impact minority shareholders in farming companies where no dividends are paid? The paper value may be large, but the value in practice is negligible, and the beneficiaries may have no cash or prospect of it. So minority shareholding in companies, how do you think that's going to be looked at going forward?
We touched on valuation previously, and this is going to be a very difficult area, and it's a bit of a circular loop, isn't it? What's the value of something if it's illiquid and doesn't produce an income? As the questioner said, there's a paper value, but in practice, if you can't realise it and you can't eat it and you can't get any fruit from it, what's it really worth? And then you go back in the loop again. So I think it's going to be a very big question from a valuation perspective, alongside the minority discounts, alongside the uncertainty and other aspects of it. And this is something which I think is going to be particularly pernicious, because you're not going to have certainty under the rules. It's the taxpayer or the executors which will have to assess that. They will then have to submit that in that form and then wait for HMRC to come back. And to the extent that I saw there was a question about, can I definitely not pay interest if I pay my tax and do it on 10-year installments? And the answer is yes, but if you're late, then you're going to have interest to pay at 4% above base. So in this example, where we don't know what the value is, you've another nasty piece of this. I don't know what the valuation, the certainty is to put in the form, and therefore what tax to pay, and therefore there might be interest on top of that to think about. But in order to pay the right amount of tax, I might have to volunteer more tax in order to pay it. So another loop. So I'm afraid I agree with the question and I don't have an answer. We do have valuers, and this will be a key area that they're looking at, and we've got lots of conversations lined up with our affected clients in that scenario.
Okay, thank you, Toby. Laura, can we have the last slide, please?
Absolutely. Bear with me a second.
Just to wrap up, we do have a succession webinar next week, a bit later time, it's 7 o'clock. We're doing this particular webinar with Fan Farmers and Roy Thorns. It's on a far more simpler platform, which I don't think we've had technical problems before with, and I'm sure it will be far more smoother than tonight. And our apologies for the technical issues we've had for both viewers watching and also the speakers. If you want to sign up for this webinar or delivery of one or more services in the Future Farming Resilience Scheme, please contact us, Newmarket at Laurence Gould, and Cheryl, who actually handles it, will take you through the registration process. Just to finish off, I'd like to thank Laura for hosting it, particularly when I was on mute. I also like to thank Toby and Emma, who I know Emma's had quite a few technical issues, for their presentations, and also for the way they've handled the questions, which I think have been quite wide-ranging and in my book very complicated. So thank you very much indeed. I hope you've enjoyed it. Everybody's going to be in this totally different situation. That's what's obviously come out of tonight's presentation. But I think, as I said during my presentation, it's important to talk, it's important to share and communicate, because we're going through some challenging times. The industry will overcome it. It'll still be there in 50 years' time. It's still producing good quality food, and the industry will still be one of the best industries in the world. But we've got to get through these challenging times over the next few years. And I said, there's people out there to support you, so don't feel you're doing it all on your own. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. For those who are watching on catch up, thank you for watching it, and we look forward to seeing you again. So thank you very much indeed, and good night.